things that Darwin noticed in his travels is life is very diverse. So he was seeing a lot of animals and plants that that most Europeans hadn't seen before. And one of the things that he was asking himself is, why is it so diverse? So that's, as we go through the theory, we'll be sort of looking at some key observations he had and questions that he asked himself, and we'll be putting those up as we go.
We did struggle with trying to figure out how to order the main concepts that make up evolution through natural selection. To start, we really had to educate ourselves. It was a suggestion that Kate made that was very helpful to me getting started. I read a few young adult books, one about Darwin and one about Charles Darwin and his wife, Emma. And those two books actually were very helpful for me in getting grounded in the historical context, theories of natural selection, and also starting to understand the theory from Darwin's point of view. And so we decided relatively early on that we wanted to try and present this story of the development of the theory of evolution through natural selection from Darwin's point of view.
We were thinking about it from the perspective of this narrative and this arc of Darwin's own explorations. We kind of came to that decision that we were going to present students with the activity to make observations, and the goal was to try to get them to ask the question that Darwin asked, right? To kind of recreate his process that way.
I think another concern for me is always that our students are urban students, and that evolution is really very abstract, unlike climate change, which you can see is happening to right now. There's some very abstract concepts here, and yet biologists speak of evolution as the kind of unifying theory of biology and how very important it is. And it also is, I mean, quite frankly, it's always going to be tested. So many teachers shy away from teaching science, especially evolution, because they feel like they don't understand it themselves well enough to articulate it. And actually, frankly, that was one reason that we wanted to do a lesson set, is to sort of provide some support for that. You know, when we're building a content-based series of lessons, we want it to make sense. We want it to, you know, not just be, as you said, something that people are asked to memorize, but something that they're asked to think through and check with themselves. Does this make sense to me? And so that's why the order was really important here.
The first one is about the diversity of life, where we're hoping that students will come up with a similar question that Darwin asked. Maybe was, why are there so many different kinds of living things?
Students actually got assigned to an organism, and then they had to talk about what category would they be in and why, and discuss sort of characteristics. So that accomplished a few things. One thing is just to sort of lay down some basic knowledge about biology and get students thinking about what they know, but also making them aware of this great diversity of life and engaging them in that thought process of thinking about how would you categorize and why. And then it was also really important because it was one of the things that Darwin was observing at that time.
One thing that I thought was really interesting about having those categories is that when people characterize different things, they saw that there are similarities between certain, like that there are things between me and a bacteria that I didn't even consider. Right. And I think that comes back. That's an idea that we kind of put out there that we came back to later.
And then at the same time, discovering fossils. So that's when, you know, we got into thinking about a timeline.
We wanted to set the context in terms of the timeline of Earth's history, so we can sort of imagine the scale of time at which evolution has occurred and continues to occur.
Yeah, so the timeline of the history of the Earth is about, again, this idea that was fresh in Darwin's time, that the Earth was a lot older than they had previously thought it was. And so there's all of this diversity of life, and it developed in a much longer period of time than we had previously thought.
And I love it because it's math skills, but when they're completed, it helps them give a sense of scale. It really also helps them see cause and effect of the development of life over time.
The next activity was looking at evidence for evolution and the similarities between the structures in living organisms, and we looked at the skeleton, the bones of a hand between a whale, a human, a bat, etc. And that was starting to get into, there's all kinds of evidence for evolution, but we were just looking at one among living organisms.
No, the turtle is thicker. There's a turtle. Yeah, but I know, but you can't see the shell.
This is holding together some kind of wing, but very light. So that's why I'm going with like a bat.
The one thing that I really liked about that is it was messier than just saying we all come from a common ancestor. Just that activity alone, I don't think was enough for. So there were some people who maybe weren't so sure, and certainly I think there would be students who wouldn't be like, oh yeah, that solves it. But it is really compelling. Like, why is my bone structure so similar to a bat, so similar to a whale, so similar to a lizard?
What's this? 1, 2, 3. What is this?
Human. Bat.
It's very important to look at the skeletons, because when you look from the outside, it's not so obvious. And I think that it really piques your interest to think about that.
The activity with the bunny problem has to do with population growth.
You know, it's the joke that rabbits produce, so much, but any population has this potential for exponential growth, but it never happens because there's this limited amount of resources that there's competition for. What determines who wins that competition is the traits and adaptation that takes place.
So the next activity was on dog breeding and artificial selection, and so the ideas that we wanted to come out there were that there's always variation within a population, that many traits that different organisms have are inheritable. Like you said, those traits give advantage to certain organisms. With dog breeding, we just wanted to show that students already know that species change over time.
And I wanted to say that I thought starting with dogs was such a good idea. That's one place where they can observe this phenomenon in their own lives and connect to something they know.
Thinking about dog breeding has the advantage that if you're not presenting it as evolution and just sort of thinking about what the elements are here, that you sort of establish some basic mechanisms that are, I mean, it's basically the exact same thing as evolution. The only thing that's different is that it's humans that are doing the selecting rather than the environment, right? So if you can sort of set up that dynamic and people understand the mechanisms there and then move to natural selection. The next step is moving on to adaptation, right? It's not humans selecting for those traits, it's the environment, right?
Right, natural selection. And that's kind of Darwin's aha moment. That's what all the other concepts kind of lead up to, is understanding natural selection. Of course, the interesting thing is he didn't actually understand how heredity worked in the body, but nevertheless, he came up with the theory. I think that one of the most effective ways to help students understand adaptation is to look at many different examples and to start with camouflage, which is a kind of obvious one, looking at how camouflage helps animals survive in the environment. But what's really very important in all this is, Mark was talking about resources, is your food source. That you're really going to adapt to your food source, and with the finches, that's what Darwin really was looking at, how they were adapting to their food source. So the variations, what's the same, they're all finches, and then the variations are their beak shape and size, and that has to do with their food source.
And this one I wouldn't know, right? But you could, if you gave the description, this one I would know about.
So what's the guiding principle here that we're working with? Beak, food source, what?
Dictates the beak type.
Okay.
Darwin's theory is often said as the survival of the fittest, and kind of that leads to a misconception of the biggest or the strongest. And so the activity that we did was about survival, right? It was about, you're this small little thing, but you're the right color. And so it's not about, it's fittest being determined by your ability to survive.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the idea of misconceptions, because one of the things that we did as a culminating activity is we asked the teachers to work together in pairs to answer some questions. And they were kind of difficult questions, like about, why did cheetahs develop the ability to run very fast? And really were a place where misconceptions would come out, student misconceptions would rise to the surface and you could really talk about them, because it is a very complex theory. It's not all that easy to understand.
We want to draw out misconceptions because they're very challenging ideas. We want to
Right.
help students do it. And I think another way that we tried to do that with the way these all fit together was, you can't just say, oh, diversity of life, there's a lot of different kind of animals, check, now we're moving on to
Yes,
you really have to kind of okay, so I got that,
Right.
but now in the context of this
Right.
second piece, kind of how does that
Right.
fit, and really help students.
Yes.
And I think we did activities and
Yes.
we put the ideas up and we kind of talked
Right.
about them in that way, because you have to keep, because
Yes.
they're all so connected, and you have to reconsider each
Yes.
one after you kind of
Yes.
get the next piece. And I think that was, it was similar to the misconception of helping students, helping scaffold their
Right.
construction of the knowledge in their head.
Yes, yes, and you want to review a lot
Yeah.
so that students have a chance to keep returning to this idea and refining their understanding of it.
Mhm.